On the night of November 1st, 1984, in a cold cell at Central Prison, North Carolina, Velma Barfield fell into deep sleep, something strange for a woman about to enter the final morning of her life. The needles had been prepared, waiting to execute the first death sentence for an American woman in over 2 decades. But Velma wasn't trembling, wasn't sleepless. She slept as if the burden of her final fate had finally given way to exhaustion. The guard assigned to closely monitor her couldn't help but wonder at this eerily calm demeanor. "Are you okay?" he asked softly in the quiet night. "Yes," Velma mumbled, turning over and sinking back into sleep, her voice low as if tomorrow wasn't approaching. Velma Barfield's life once seemed boringly ordinary. Born in 1932 on a farm in South Carolina, she grew up like any other country girl, married, had children, became a grandmother, and lived what people call a peaceful life. But behind that gentle facade was a dark truth no one suspected. In 1978, the death of Stuart Taylor, her fiancé, opened the door to a bloody chain of secrets. Taylor died in pain after drinking beer laced with arsenic, and when police began investigating, they discovered a terrifying pattern that had existed for years. Velma wasn't an impulsive killer. She was a patient, calculating, and extremely dangerous predator. Her trial exposed a shocking truth. Stuart Taylor wasn't the first victim. Velma's 2 previous husbands both died under suspicious circumstances, one in a mysterious fire, the other poisoned. Even her own mother didn't escape her hands. Lily Bullard was poisoned by her daughter twice, and the second time, in 1974, took her life. But the most frightening thing wasn't the deaths within the family. Velma had worked as a caregiver for elderly patients, a job requiring absolute trust. 3 patients lost their lives under her care, all poisoned with arsenic, all dying under suspicion concealed by the gentle smile of the woman they trusted. Investigators gradually pieced together the puzzle. Velma's motive wasn't hatred or madness, but debt. She became addicted to painkillers after a serious car accident, and to cover the cost of buying drugs, she forged checks, stole money, and finally, killed people to cover up her crimes. Each death was carefully disguised as natural illness, and for years, no one suspected this small woman with the soft voice. But Stuart Taylor's death, the man who loved her and planned to marry her, became the final mistake that brought the entire house of cards crashing down. When the truth was exposed, the public shuddered. This wasn't a kind grandmother. This was a serial killer who had murdered at least 6 people, possibly more, and had evaded justice for nearly a decade. Velma didn't wake until after 6 a.m. She coughed softly, sat up, and asked the guard for hot water and instant coffee. "I slept really well," she remarked with a faint smile while cradling the hot coffee cup in her palms. "Must be because the night before I barely slept." She even chuckled, as if finding something amusing about sleeping soundly before the final hour of her life. No one in the room laughed with her. Coffee cup in hand, Velma flipped through a worn Bible, steady fingers gliding across pages that had been dog-eared many times. On death row, she had found faith, or at least that's what she claimed. Velma Barfield had become a born-again Christian, a believer reborn in faith. That faith became her anchor, keeping her from sinking in those final hours, and she spent her remaining years preaching to other inmates, even some guards. Velma's clemency petition to Governor Jim Hunt relied entirely on this spiritual transformation. She argued that her newfound faith was evidence of rehabilitation, that the woman who once killed 6 people with poison had now become God's instrument in prison. Ministers, volunteers, and even some inmates wrote letters pleading for mercy for her. But however genuine her repentance, it couldn't erase what arsenic poison had done. Couldn't revive the dead, couldn't erase the tears of victims' families. Velma Barfield's case occurred against the backdrop of America fiercely debating capital punishment, especially when it involved women. In 1984, no woman had been executed since 1962. Many believed American society couldn't and shouldn't execute a grandmother. Others argued gender couldn't be a shield from justice. Velma Barfield stood at the center of that debate. Prison logs recorded her every movement on her final day. Appears very calm, a guard wrote around 9 a.m. as Velma removed her hair curlers, letting her hair fall neatly around her face. When guards came to escort her to meet visitors, she was handcuffed, the freshly curled hair creating a strange contrast with the solemn atmosphere of the day. Visiting hours were scheduled from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Escorted by guards, Velma walked down the corridor toward the inmate elevator, where a uniformed officer stepped forward with a flower in hand. "Mrs. Barfield," he said gently, holding out a bright yellow chrysanthemum from the prison chapel before her. "This is from the men at Central Prison, a small gift expressing their love and concern for you today." The guards hesitated, unsure whether she was allowed to receive it, but when Velma reached out, they didn't stop her. "Please thank them for me," she said calmly, voice steady as she embraced the flower. In the brutal world of death row, where human hearts seem hardened, a yellow flower unexpectedly became a symbol of something even killers crave: compassion. Just after 11:30, Velma sat waiting in the visiting room, eyes bright toward the door. She'd been anticipating this meeting for months. When Pastor Hugh Hoyle, her spiritual shepherd, finally walked in for the first time since Christmas, she stood to greet him with a warm and sincere smile. Later, he would recall her joy, so genuine it seemed disconnected from the brutal reality of that day. But Hoyle hadn't come just to share happiness. He brought cruel news. Grasping her hand as they sat down, he announced immediately, "Velma, I just heard your final appeal has been denied." She looked away briefly, then turned back, eyes unwavering. "Oh, I figured as much," she said softly. "Is there anything left to confess?" Hoyle asked. "No, Pastor, I'm ready." By lunchtime, Velma was served bean soup with crackers and a glass of fruit juice. She ate quietly, flipping through stacks of newly arrived letters and telegrams. "Don't worry about me," she told the ministers present, urging them to focus on the 39 other men remaining on death row. She understood their pain, the burden they carried. Hours passed, and that afternoon, Velma received many visitors. Her two brothers, Jimmy and John, came to visit, along with a relative. But the final 2 hours of visiting time were reserved entirely for Velma's two children, Ronnie and Pam. No one else was allowed to intrude on this sacred time. The moment Pam entered the visiting room, she embraced her mother tightly and sobbed uncontrollably. Ronnie stood nearby, struggling to find appropriate words. Velma, though calm about her impending reality, didn't focus on her own death. Instead, she gave final instructions to her son. Take care of Pam, handle funeral arrangements, and preserve memories of happier times. These moments, though bitter, brought fleeting comfort to all three. In those 2 hours, they weren't death row inmate and relatives. They were just a family trying to find final goodbyes. Velma didn't speak of fear, didn't speak of deep regret. She just wanted to ensure her children would be okay after she was gone. When the visit ended, the farewell became indescribably painful. Pam refused to let go, clinging to her mother with all her strength. It was Ronnie, though suffering but steadfast, who gently pulled his sister away. As they left, Ronnie urged Pam not to look back, but the image of Velma in those final hours was forever etched in their memories. Returning to her cell, Velma's composure finally crumbled. Alone, she allowed herself to grieve. The goodbyes had ended, but their weight remained. At 6:13 p.m., Velma ordered cheese doodles and a bottle of Coca-Cola. When the snacks arrived nearly 30 minutes late, she added a pen and 2 small white Bibles from her belongings to the order. She set the snacks and soda aside, picked up the pen. Her fingers quickly turned orange, a sacred irony, as she wrote heartfelt messages in the Bibles. By 7:15, guards escorted Velma from her cell, wrists handcuffed. Her 2 lawyers stood waiting to see her one last time, each holding a rose. Their smiles were strained, an attempt to bring comfort in a moment when words couldn't suffice. The 3 spent over an hour together in an emotional farewell. Velma had agreed to the final appeals not for herself, but because she understood how important it was to them. That made the court rejections even more painful, especially for Richard Burr. To Richard, Velma wasn't just a client. She was the first case he pursued to the end. Years later, he would recall that moment with stunning honesty. "I had a terrible feeling of failure. I cried, telling her how sorry I was. In that room, there were no more legal arguments or courtroom battles, only connection, human compassion, and the silent burden of knowing this was goodbye. The moment Velma set down her pen and carefully arranged the letters and postcards ready for the mailroom, a guard appeared at her cell door. "Are you ready to see the minister?" he asked. "Any time," she replied, voice calm. Pastor Phil Carter entered the cell at 11:30 p.m., unusually anxious, afraid he might not bring the comfort Velma needed. But almost immediately, his unease vanished. Her concerns weren't for herself. She only spoke about others, her children, family, lawyers, the prison warden, the pastor himself, even those preparing to take her life. That's all she talked about, he would recall later. In the history of American executions, rarely has a death row inmate in their final hours focused entirely on comforting others rather than themselves. This was Velma Barfield's final paradox, a callous serial killer now displaying deep compassion, though far too late. The clock showed 1:45 a.m. on November 2, 1984. The final moment had arrived. Velma wore pink pajamas, her final request honored. An adult diaper was added as a brutally practical procedure. A stethoscope and heart monitor were attached to her chest. The wheeled gurney arrived at her cell. Guards used thick straps to secure her body and legs, then inserted IV lines into her arms. Saline solution began dripping as she was prepared for her final journey. Lethal injection, first used by America in 1982, was considered more humane than the electric chair or gas chamber. But for death penalty opponents, no way of killing a person could be called humane. A few minutes before 2 a.m., the grandmother on death row was wheeled into the execution chamber. Witnesses looked through the glass, silent witnesses to what some viewed as justice and others viewed as revenge. 3 syringes were attached to the IV line, each operated by a different volunteer. One line was a placebo, ensuring none of them knew for certain whether they had administered the lethal dose. This was how the system tried to reduce the psychological burden on those executing the sentence, a tacit acknowledgement that taking human life, even under court order, still leaves scars on the executioner's soul. When asked if she had any final words, Velma said calmly, "I want to say I'm sorry for all the hurt that I have caused. I know everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families involved, and I'm sorry. I want to thank everybody who has been supporting me through these 6 years." Shortly after the warden gave the signal, at exactly 2:15 a.m., Velma Barfield was pronounced dead. The process was smooth, clinical, and uncompromising in its finality. 10 minutes later, her body was loaded into a waiting ambulance, gliding past crowds of protesters on both sides of the death penalty debate. Outside the prison, death penalty supporters gathered with signs reading, "Justice for the victims." On the opposite side, opponents held candles and sang hymns, praying for Velma's soul and for a society that no longer kills in the name of justice. Both sides believed they stood on the right side. But in the departing ambulance, there were no more arguments. Only a lifeless body of a woman who had been a mother, grandmother, caregiver, believer, and killer. If your mother were convicted of crimes like these, would you still visit her on her final day?